Okay, so the next question I've got is just around the zones to meet the principles. The principles are very broad. Surely we don't need zones to actually reflect those principles everywhere. If we've got a given quantity of population and housing that we're interested in accommodating, so long as we're accommodating that, meeting the principles and meeting the zoning requirements with adequacy, isn't that enough?
So what we're trying to achieve is integrated, comprehensive neighbourhoods which provide not just the opportunity for more housing if that's needed, but also housing choice. The principles that the Auckland Development Committee adopted are quite specific, and if I refer you to page 91 of your agenda, it goes into specifics of how far away a zone should be from a town centre, a bus station, a rail station, all of those. Those were all taken to the Auckland Development Committee, and they were part of the decisions of the Auckland Development Committee about how we should apply those zones. That is what officers have followed. As John has said, there are sometimes circumstances where we can't follow those principles because you have already identified some areas of the city as being subject to pre-1944 overlay controls, or to flooding, where you've said it always has to be single house, or to places where there are other overlays that prevent us applying these exact. But everywhere else, we've followed the guidance that the committee, the Auckland Development Committee, which is a council committee of the whole, set for officers to follow, and that's what we've done.
If I can just go to my question, I understand you've followed something. The point that I'm making is, to meet housing choice, to meet the number of houses, we don't have to follow it everywhere. That's my point. Well, principles are fine, but it doesn't mean to say that the principle applies everywhere. So I'll leave it at that. I probably won't get an answer to that. I'll just go on to the other question that I've got, which is around this issue of the experts. So we've had experts that have been giving advice from day one. Those experts were obviously involved with the proposed unitary plan as it went out. And later on, there's this upzoning and out of scope that's come along, that's taking things a bit further. I would have thought that the experts would still be able to at least defend the proposed plan and everything prior to the out of scope. It doesn't knock them out altogether, does it?
So in terms
Have we asked them?
Sure, hang on, Wayne, Councillor Wayne. So, we don't need to argue with the officers here necessarily. They're going to answer it. Okay, so there you go.
So, as you will be aware, the proposed unitary plan is a combination of staff recommendations and political decisions, and as notified, it went out, but the whole process of having a submission, further submission and hearings process is an acknowledgement that any notified plan or notified plan change can actually be improved by listening to the submissions, having the conversation in a hearing where a panel, whether it's a council panel or in this case an independent hearings panel, has the opportunity to hear the different views of the submitters and weigh up their issues and concerns and then make changes to the plan. That's the process that is set up under the special legislation, but it's also the process under the Resource Management Act. Otherwise, you'd have a plan that, if it's notified and then cannot be changed on recommendation, you would have to ask the question why it cannot be changed. So the submissions, the guidance we've had from the independent hearing panel has been considered by the planners that were involved in pulling together the proposed plan. As I've said, the proposed plan was a combination of staff recommendations, but it also was a combination of political decisions that did not necessarily coincide with the staff recommendations. Staff have now been asked to look at those in light of the submissions and the principles, and that's why there has been a shift in some places. But it's also because of other decisions, and as John has said, is that the council's evidence on things like pre-1944 has changed where that overlay is, and we have to change the zoning that reflects that where that happens. Sure, so it's been building up along the way. I've
heard what you've said. I've listened to every word, but you haven't answered my question, which was around whether, which is around whether or not it's not possible for the experts that have been involved throughout the process to continue to represent us before the independent hearing panel, based at least on all the evidence up to, but before, out of scope.
So we would, I think the issue, so we have not yet asked our staff that question, and the reason...
Order, please. Order.
The reason why we haven't asked that staff is that they have just completed 260 pieces of evidence which they have written to support the position that we have put forward to the independent hearings panel.
So I understand they haven't been asked.
But
So
hang
how
on,
can
hang
you
on.
make the contention?
Hang on.
Okay.
Their positions have been based on the directions that have been given by this council and our evidence on all the other parts of the plan. So in terms of asking them, can you go back and support what was in the notified version of the plan, that has shifted on because through those 60 hearings that we have attended on your behalf, we have been putting forward changes in the position based on your understanding of the submissions, based on the issues that you feel should be amended after hearing those submissions. It is not the same plan that was notified in terms of our position on that plan, and to ask officers to go back and forget that the position they've taken in the residential provisions, that they've taken in the regional policy statements, puts them in the situation that John has identified to you. There is a code of conduct and a code of practice that all professional planners must follow. They are asked questions when they appear at hearings, whether or not they're giving their best professional advice, and that will be something that they will really struggle with in terms of the fact that you are now changing, you potentially are changing what they are there to represent. So that's all I can really say on the subject. We believe we will struggle to find staff who feel professionally that they can support a withdrawal out of scope which would represent spot zoning but also would not address the principles that the Independent Hearings Panel has asked us to follow, nor the principles that this council has asked us to follow.
Through you, Mr Mayor, just to finish, I was referring to everything up to out of scope, and I would think that would include just about everything. That's enough from me.
Right, thank you. Councillor Penny. House.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Cooper and I think we're heading down the same track, so I just want to verify in some of the submission given by Richard Booton, the statement has been made that this would leave the IHP in the position of having evidence from council proposing the zone changes but no evidence from any other party. So am I correct in hearing that we now have evidence and pieces of evidence prepared by many other submitters in response to our evidence and that they will be heard?
That's correct. At the last conversation we had with the Hearings Panel Office, they had received over 1,200 pieces of evidence that has been written in response to our evidence. So they waited until, obviously, we lodged our evidence, and then they've written their evidence in response to that evidence. And our written evidence does not go in scope, out of scope. It has the maps that clearly show it, but our written evidence is about an integrated outcome for neighbourhoods.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, Councillor Penny Webster.
Yes, thank you. I've heard quite a bit today. It's very interesting. But Penny, in your long experience, how long, once a zone gets put on an area, how long does it take for that area to change? Because in my experience, I know that there are people in Kumeu with future urban zoning that have been waiting for about 20 odd years to be able to do anything. And some of the debate we're hearing at the moment, and Shale made comments about this is people's homes, it would sound as if as soon as the zoning's put on, we're going to move in with the bulldozers, knock it all down and build, 3-storied houses. So, and actually, in my experience, if somebody wants to sell their house, the person that comes in can then build whatever the zone is. No one's forcing anyone to put those on their sections. It's a very simplistic thing, but some of the debate that we've been hearing really makes me wonder. So in your experience of Auckland Isthmus, how many big changes have been made because a zoning's been put on somewhere?
So in terms of the Auckland Isthmus, because I obviously don't have experience in the future urban zones, but in terms of the Auckland Isthmus, the operative Isthmus District Plan was notified back in the early 1990s and became operative in the late 1990s. And that's been the zoning that's been there since then. There are quite large areas of the Isthmus that have been zoned for high density development that have never been zoned for high density development. And I think the issue is planning is an enabling document. It allows you to do things, but it doesn't make you do things. Exactly. And I think sometimes when we talk about changes being imposed on people, people do feel that suddenly somebody's going to make them do something. But the fact that you have a zoning underneath you that allows for more development on your property is entirely your choice about whether you take up that opportunity. And I think the role of the council in looking at all of the zones is to ensure that the rules that we impose in those zones actually protects the boundary issues that many people have concerns about. So in the proposed unitary plan provisions, we have put in setbacks and rules that prevent 3 stories right on your boundary. That's just not achievable under the proposed provisions.
Thank you. Right, thank you. Right, got Councillor, order please. Councillor George.
Well, thank you, Mr Mayor. A question that I'm kind of trying to wrestle with in my mind is, when the plan was proposed and went out and signed off in 2013, it was, I remember we had those planning sessions over at the Rendezvous Hotel. I think we had a couple there with the local boards, and it was finalised at that stage, and it then went out. Now, what's the reason for this huge upzoning which has happened in places like Glendowie and which, as you know, as a result of that? Because it just seems that this is a backdoor way of kind of clawing back or whatever. What was reduced back in 2013? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, is it correct? So, John, the question is, just explain, okay? I mean, we've been going through this process now for another 2 years. So, now you've had a crack at explaining this about 4 times so far, so have another go.
So, Your Worship, with any plan that goes out for submissions, there are always going to be good, valid submissions that indicate that the plan that went out wasn't correct. And I guess that's the role of the whole submission process and planning under the RMA in this country, as it has been for many years, and under the Town and Country Planning Act, is to enable people to submit on the plan for changes. And so we have 4,000 submissions on the zoning maps, 20,000 site-specific changes, and a whole lot of broad submissions on the policy statement, regional policy statement, the residential zones themselves, and some broad rezoning submissions that we're saying don't strictly give us scope. But there are so many submissions asking for changes, and so the plan wasn't perfect when it went out. These plans never are, and now is the opportunity for some of those changes to be considered. So that's why.
Are you more than doubled it?
Yeah,
but these are fairly substantial, aren't they? The places like where that man was talking.
Well,
about,
I think
Glendowie,
without wanting to talk about specifics.
Hang on,
80%
John,
change.
just stop.
Okay.
George, you got the floor.
Okay.
Now just.
Okay. Well,
I'm
saying I can look at 3 places. Glendowie, Kohimarama seems extensive upzoning. Howick, which we looked at the other day, seems to be very minimal upzoning, but despite the fact that there's a substantial hinterland of single houses just by the Howick village. And then you go to Takapuna, where it's kind of a spot upzoning, and it's not right near the centre, because I've just looked at it on Google Map and it's actually 1.2 kilometres away from the Takapuna bus station. So I'm kind of trying to wrestle in my mind as to how you've come about the way that these have happened.
Well, Mr Mayor, it's primarily through the principles set by the Auckland Development Committee, looking at the submissions, looking at particular places in terms of transport centres and so on. But in many cases that you're talking about, the changes from the single house zone, which was a down zoning relative to the operative rules, to mixed house and suburban, which is still 2 stories, still very restrictive in terms of the amount of a property you can cover in buildings. So then when you say a significant upzoning, that change from single house to mixed house and suburban, it is very debatable as to whether that's a significant upzoning, and relative to the operative rules, it's...
Order.
Well, John,
Well, a lot of the media debate has been around 3 stories and above. This mixed house and suburban, which is a big area of the upzoning, if you like, is still 2 stories and 40% building coverage.
yeah.
Okay.
I just want to finish, Mr Mayor.
Yeah, now, George,